So I know she doesn't need any introduction, and I know you all want to hear her speak, so I'm going to turn over the microphone to Mrs. Finder. She will take questions at the end of her talk, and we're going to have to do some relaying back and forth because she has some difficulty hearing. So please save your questions until the end. Please join me in welcoming Mrs. Finder.
Okay, good. Well, as you all know probably by now that I am a survivor of the Holocaust, and I'm a survivor on Schindler's List. And if it was not for Oskar Schindler, I would not be here. There was no way that my mother and I would have survived. And I feel that for Oskar Schindler, who could not stand by and do nothing while the rest of the world didn't do anything, my duty is to thank him. And how can you thank somebody who saved your life? And my way is of talking about him. Because for many years after the war, where Holocaust was something that people didn't really want to hear about it, and were not interested to know the details, I was always committed to talk about Oskar Schindler. And I am very grateful to Steven Spielberg for making that movie, because there were very many movies about the Holocaust before Schindler's List. And but they were usually shown at selected times, at selected theaters, and very few people went to see it. And even when Thomas Keneally published the book, it was first published in England under the title of Schindler's Ark, and then in the United States and all over the world under Schindler's List. It really was not on bestseller. It was not until Steven Spielberg started to make that movie. And then when he was shooting the movie in Krakow, Poland, where it all happened, people, survivors, started to come and watch him and express their gratitude for making that movie. As you all know, the movie broke all records. It got so many Oscars, and it reached millions of people because it really reached everybody's living room, and people started to talk about it. And they wouldn't be interested if it wasn't for Steven Spielberg. So I feel that the movie sort of broke the silence, broke the wall down, for the survivors to be able to talk about what happened to us. I mean, there were people that asked me when I first came to the United States, was it really true? Is it really happen? Was it like what we saw in the movies, on the newsreel? And when I wanted to say yes, it was very bad, and people would say, oh, it was so bad for us. We didn't have sugar, we couldn't buy gas, we couldn't buy nylons. So we stopped talking because we knew people were not interested. And in the early 1970s, there was a professor in Sorbonne who published papers that Holocaust never happened, that there were no gas chambers, no ovens in Auschwitz, that there was a bakery. Well, I remember when I first heard it on the news, I was so upset, and I felt now is the time for the survivors to be able to say what really happened. And that's what I feel as long as I can. You know, I was one of the youngest on Schindler's List, and I'm one of the few ones left. And the same goes for the GIs, for the veterans, for those who saved us. Because when those on their way to Berlin, after the Battle of the Bulge, so exhausted, and they opened the gates to hell, they came upon concentration camps, and they were so shocked and so sick to their heart that most of them came home and didn't want to talk about it either. And it is only as they became older that they wanted to share their stories to make sure that people knew that it was really true, it really happened. Because even though the Holocaust was mainly to murder all the Jews, Hitler had killed many other people that were not Jews. Hitler killed his own people. Hitler took children from parents, children who were mentally handicapped or physically handicapped. And he told his people that he built a special hospital to make the children better. But what he really did was killing them, euthanize the children, and then would send to the parents a can of ashes. And those are the facts that are really not very well known. And it is so important, especially for the survivors and for the GIs, to pass the torch of memory to the younger generation, the second and third and fourth and those yet to come. Because what's happening in this world now with all the horrible genocide, and still nothing is really being helped. Everybody's talking, but nobody's doing anything. So we're not leaving this world for our children in good conditions. And it is up to the younger generation to try and make changes. And I always tell my students that they can make a difference in the world. They can change the world because they are all smart. I mean, I have not met a student that is not smart. So they know what's right from wrong. And they have to learn and realize that they have the power to make changes. They have the power to become an upstander and not to be a bystander. It was Albert Schweitzer that said once, the world is a terrible place. Not because of the bad things that are happening, but because of the people who do nothing. And this is what Oskar Schindler had proven to the world. There is never a time when you said, well, there was nothing you can do. There is always something you can do. Do you know, if you really think about it, the concentration camps were built very close to the villages of the towns of the cities, down the road from where people lived their so-called normal lives. So there is no way anybody can say, I didn't know, I didn't see. They all knew, they all saw, but they just became totally deaf and blind because it wasn't happening to them. And you know, I was born in Krakow in Poland, and Krakow is a beautiful city. I hope if any of you ever go to Poland, you have to go to Krakow. I lived on a street right next to an ancient castle, Wawel, and right across the river, Vistula. And I had a wonderful childhood. I was an only child. My parents had a lot of siblings. My father had 6 brothers and a sister. So my mother had 4 brothers and 3 sisters. There were all kinds of little cousins to play with. Now, because I was Jewish, I didn't have very many Polish friends. Now, the Jewish people lived in Poland for centuries and were very, very patriotic. All my uncles and my grandfathers fought for the independence of Poland. And my mother's older brother was a surgeon, and he was killed on the battlefield. And my grandparents were awarded some kind of a special medal that they were very proud of. My father traveled a lot, and he used to go to Germany on business. And when he would come back from Germany, he would always bring me some kind of a present that was something you couldn't buy in Poland. So my idea always was that the German people were very educated, very cultured. They were known for its musicians and composers, its poets, its writers, and they were ordinary people. People you come across your life every single day. They were doctors and lawyers and judges and plumbers and electricians and street cleaners. They were normal people. They were fathers and husbands and brothers and sons. How could you ever imagine that all those ordinary people would become so cold-blooded, sadistic, cruel murderers? You know, to this day, I can't believe that this really happened, that people went along with it. You know, Hitler wanted to have an Aryan race. He only wanted people that were tall, slim, blue-eyed, and blonde. Well, you've all seen pictures of Hitler. He was certainly not blonde, he was certainly not tall, neither were any of his co-workers. His group of bandits, those who were giving orders to kill. There is a speech that Himmler made in Poznan in 1941, after they were about to go and murder like 20,000 Jewish people. And he was telling them that this is the proudest day of history, and it is a day that cannot be talked about, and how he respects them and admires them for, and how proud he is of the way they are behaving, for killing all the people and going and still being decent people. I think that speech should be really published more often, because it is so unthinkable that things like that could have happened in the 20th century. When Hitler invaded Poland in 1939, my father was very optimistic, because they said, well, you know, the world would hear about what's happening and they would come and help us. After all, in the First War, wars are terrible. There is never enough food. There is always freezing in the winter, and people suffer. But it's a war between soldiers, between military. Nobody expected this was going to be a war, not only with other countries, other military, but against innocent people. And when the Germans invaded Poland overnight, from being a little girl, I became an enemy of the state. And my crime was that I was Jewish. Because as soon as the Germans settled the government on the Wawel, this ancient, beautiful castle, they issued all kinds of orders against the Jewish people. So like overnight, they took all our civil rights away. Our bank accounts were frozen, our businesses were taken away from us, our Jewish children could not go to school anymore, the temples and synagogues were burned or made into stables. People, especially the people who were very religious, who dressed differently, were caught on the street. The people who believed in not shaving their beards and who would be shaved by the soldiers, making fun of. Women were taken to clean the snow, water streets. And we were told that Krakow was going to become Judenfrei, which means that Krakow was going to be free of Jews. Now in 1939, there were about 250,000 people living in Krakow, and about 45,000 were Jews. And the Jewish people were allowed to live all over the place. There was a special section for very religious Jewish people who lived because it was close to the temple, so they could walk, and you were not supposed to ride. Of course, nobody had cars in those days, but we had streetcars. And all of a sudden, it was like, what's going to happen to us? And my father said, oh yes, the world is going to hear about us and they will come and save us. We were told that anybody under 12 and anybody over 55 would not be allowed to remain in Krakow. They will all be sent away to the farms to help the farmer grow food for the German army. And the rest of those who would get a permit would be relocated into the ghetto. Now, you know what is a ghetto? The ghetto is really part of the city. This in Krakow, which was part of the old city, a very small part. Before that, before the war, there were maybe 20,000 people living there. And this time, they took an area of about 3 blocks long and 1 avenue wide, and they built a wall all around it and put barbed wires on top. And into that place, the Jewish people, to be lucky enough, we sought to get a permit. We were going to be moved in. I was very lucky because even though I was only 11 years old, I was told for my age, and my parents were able to falsify my birth certificate. And I remember standing in line in front of the building where the officers were to get a permit, and we were surrounded like by what it seemed to me hundreds and hundreds of Nazi soldiers. And they were armed not just with revolvers and rifles, but they had dogs. They had these huge dogs. I've never seen such dogs before. And they were muzzled, and they growled, and they were trying to tear people apart. And one of the soldiers stood maybe 300 meters away from me, was threatening me that he's gonna let the dog jump on me and tear me apart. And I was 11 years old. But you know what I remember the most is that as we stood in line in that big circle, all around us, the Polish people went about their business. They were occupied, but they were not enslaved like we were. We were slaves. So life went on for them. So they were walking around, they were going around, to schools, to shops were open, the streetcars went by, and there we were, thousands of people standing, surrounded by soldiers who were separating families, throwing children on the trucks, and throwing parents on different trucks. So people were crying, and the soldiers were shooting, and yet around us, life went on like nothing was happening. Nobody saw us. It's like we didn't exist. That was such a feeling of betrayal I felt. I could not believe this was actually happening. After we were lucky enough to get a permit, we had to leave our apartments. We were given 3 weeks. And we were told, of course, that when we were going to go into the ghetto, we'd share the room with other families. So we could only take each one small suitcase, and my father was able and allowed to get a pushcart. So I remember we put pots and pans and the linens and pillows and comforters. I remember we dressed in so many layers because it was March and it was still cold, and we couldn't take everything with us. I also remember that my mother made me clean. We lived in a very nice apartment building, and we had mail slots in our door. The mailman used to go up on every floor and put the mail in your door. And my mother made me polish the mail slot. And I remember we had to leave at a certain time and turn the key to the superintendent of the building. And I stood in my bedroom, and I looked around, and I had so many books that I loved. I loved to read. I had a collection of Shirley Temple dolls. I know that, I don't know how many people here would know about Shirley Temple, because that was a long time ago, but I was a very good student. And if I went on the honor roll, my mother would ask me what I want. I could get a doll, or I could get a book. So I had a little collection of Shirley Temple dolls. And my mother said, well, we can take it, there is no room. And we just walked out of the apartment with dishes still, in a pantry, and linens in a closet, and some clothing of ours, and all the furniture. So my father, if I remember correctly, took a mattress. And we walked through the streets of Krakow. We crossed the bridge to the ghetto over the river Vistula. And there were people lined up on the roads, little kids, and they were picking up stones. It was muddy, I remember. They were throwing at us and saying, good riddance, Jews, don't ever come back. And we walked into the ghetto, and we were assigned an apartment. It was in such an old building that the bathrooms were in a hall. So you shared it with the neighbors. And this building was so old, and that we walked up the stairs, and we walked fourth floor, I remember, and we walked into a tiny kitchen. There was no table to be able to eat over there, and there was an oven, and I remember there was this sink that was so tiny and so small, and I had just seen the movie Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and I said to my mom, why that thing looks big enough for the dwarves, not for us. And we walked into the first bedroom, very small rooms, and there were two families there. And then we walked into the other bedroom, and there was a family of 3. So I remember my parents put a hook on each side of the wall and tied on a rope and hung up a blanket, and we unpacked our things. And my father said, don't worry, because somebody's going to hear about what's happening, and they will come, and, that's not going to last. It's not going to last. In the meantime, since all our businesses, the Jewish businesses, were taken away, the people who own businesses were told to create workshops in the ghetto so that the slaves would work. There were like 2 shifts from 6 in the morning to 6 at night, and then there was one that would come 6 at night and 6 in the morning. So there were many workshops. There was dressmakers, and there were tailors, there were fur makers, there were people that were sewing uniforms, people that were making hats and for soldiers. I was working in the printing shop, and I remember there was a machine. They had a huge bales of paper you put on a machine, and the paper would go in, and it would make lines, like for school kids. And we felt, since we were workers and we were not paid, we were slaves, and we were hard workers, they're gonna let us live because they're gonna need us. Well, of course they didn't. Every morning, every night, you never knew when, they would barge into an apartment, and they would come and look in the workshops. And if they didn't like you for whatever reason, they would just take people away. And the ghetto was a terrible place. In the ghetto, we didn't get the electricity at all times. They would shut the water at most of the times. There was very little food. There were very little stores to buy anything, and we had very little rations. People were getting sick. People were afraid to go to the hospital because the soldiers were there every morning, and if you were there from the night before, you would be killed. And my father was still very optimistic. And I remember one day, like every week, we were told that we had to go and get another permit. And each time people went, we got less and less and less permits. There were less and less people. And people were taken away, supposedly to help the farmers, and we never heard from them. And I remember one day especially, my mother told me that I had to hide with my grandparents, because we lived in this huge building, and there was a huge courtyard with a huge mountain of dirt, leaves, dry grass, pine needles, and my grandparents would not get a permit anymore. And so we hid over there. We sort of like built a tunnel, and my mother covered us, and she had to go to work. And I remember laying there on my stomach and feeling the earth shaking when the soldiers came in trucks, and then they were running through the streets, the sound of their boots making such noise. They were running in and out of the building, and they were shooting, evidently finding people who were hiding. And I thought it will never end. And then after like eternity, it seemed to me, they started to leave. And as they were leaving, they were poking this big mountain where we were with their rifles. And I was sure they're going to find us, but they didn't, and they left. And then after a while, my mom came, and she said, it's all clear, there was nobody left, and we could come out. So we crawled out from under this dirt, and we stood there trying to clean up. I remember with so much grass, so much pine needles in my hair. And all of a sudden, we came face to face. It was like the last patrol of the day. There was nobody on the street. It was empty. Just 2 young soldiers came by, they took one look at my grandparents and they took them away. But they were actually nice to them and to us. They didn't kill us. It was obvious that we were hiding. And I still remember my grandparents walking away, holding hands, and my grandmother turned around and she whispered to me not to worry, everything will be okay. Of course, I never saw them again. It was also at the time that we heard about Oskar Schindler. As you all know, and I hope you all have seen the movie, and if you didn't, please do, because again, the movie is exactly of what happened to us. You ever seen that movie is what happened to me and my mother, and all the others who survived because of Oskar Schindler. So we started to hear about Oskar Schindler, and we heard that this was a German, born in Czechoslovakia, and he used to travel before the war. He was a salesman for farm machinery, and he knew Krakow very well. He was one of the very first ones to join the Nazi party, and he made a lot of friends. He was very good looking, very outgoing, very ambitious, wanted to make a lot of money. So he came to Krakow after he became German, and he took over a factory that was making pots and pans before the war, called Emalia factory. And he converted part of the factory for making ammunition. He made a lot of friends with the generals, high-ranking generals. And so he was needed by the War Department, and the other part of the factory was still making pots and pans. And Oskar Schindler really had such a wonderful personality that he entertained the so-called friends. He was buying them expensive gifts. He was hosting beautiful parties where everybody drank. He never got drunk. He would gamble with them, he would lose. They loved him. And they were very proud of him because he felt he needed more workers and he was hiring more Jewish people. And you know, when I first saw him and he had a big diamond swastika, I didn't quite trust him in the beginning. But then we found out that when he knew that there would be a search for people, that the Nazis would come at night and arrest more people and send them out to die, Oskar Schindler would keep his workers in the factory overnight so that they wouldn't be taken away. And at that time also, after a couple of weeks after my grandparents were taken away, my father was arrested. He was charged with being in the resistance. That was not true. And that would have been impossible at that time. But somebody said that, and my father was taken away, and I never saw him again. And if you saw the movie, you will remember when Amon Gert, a man who was born in Vienna, whose family was very prominent, they were publishers, and we said, well, if he comes from Vienna, naturally he's going to be much nicer. Well, Amon Gert, who was in charge of liquidating the ghetto and building a concentration camp, Plaszow, outside of the ghetto, maybe 7 kilometers, he was the most sadistic, the most cruel, the most horrible person that ever lived. There was nothing human about him. He enjoyed hunting, but he was hunting for people. Amon Gert had a villa at the beginning of the camp. The camp was built on 3 Jewish cemeteries. And you can imagine what happens to a cemetery when they level the ground. The men were in charge of building the barracks, and the women were in charge of building the road. Now you all know what it takes to build the road. A woman sitting on a road, trying to break up big stones, most of them were from the cemetery, can't build a road. And Amon Gert every morning would stand on his balcony, and he was hunting. He was looking at the people that walk, work, and he would shoot for no reason. Oskar Schindler became a very good friend with Amon Ged. He needed him. His people would now be going to camp, and it would take a lot to make sure that they were allowed to come to work on time. Because once we got into the camp, every morning and every night, we were standing for a roll call. And every morning and every night, we were exposed to constant beating, hanging, shooting, just because Amon Ged felt like it. And it was then that Oskar Schindler requested from Amon Ged that he wants to build a camp next to his factory because it would be easier for his workers to work more longer hours. They wouldn't have to waste the time walking back and forth. And because he was such good friends, Amon Ged agreed. And that was the blessing. That was the blessing that came to my mother and me and other people. Because when the factory, when the camp was ready, Oskar Schindler requested 150 more women to come and work. So that we were able to leave Plaszow, my mother and I. It was like leaving hell, and go to work in heaven, and to work for Oskar Schindler. The camp was much smaller. We actually had barracks that didn't have just like shelves, but actually had bunk beds. And of course, we had more food, because Oskar Schindler saw to it he was buying food on the black market. To us, Oskar Schindler was like an angel sent from heaven. I looked at him sometimes and I wondered, like, is he gonna grow wings? It was funny too, because some of the girls, it was at that time, the Gone with the Wind was published, so everybody had read that. So everybody, all the older girls, I was of course too young, but some of the older girls, they were all in love with Oskar Schindler. He couldn't help it. He walked into the factory every morning, he had a smile. He talked to us. To him, we were human beings. And we became his friends. He depended on us to make him rich. And he became very rich. But you see, the richer he was, the more people he wanted to save. Life under Oskar Schindler had hope. Life in Plaszow had no hope. You never knew who would be next. Oskar Schindler did things that nobody else did. If somebody was sick, he took care. If somebody needed medication, he took care. If somebody, I remember one of my friends who wore glasses, his glasses broke. Oskar Schindler saw to it that he got glasses. There's nobody like that during the whole war. Where was the church? Where were the doctors? Where were the doctors who had sworn on oaths to take care of people? What happened to them? What happened to the teachers, the professors? Of course, those who didn't agree with Hitler were killed. But how could the rest of the world follow him? It's something that I will never really understand. How could his own people not realize? How could people become so full of hate that killing innocent people would become fun for them and something they felt it was honorable to do? The tragedy was also that while we were so happy working for Oskar Schindler, Germany was losing the war against the Allies, but they were determined to win the war against the Jews. So all the camps were being liquidated and sent into Germany, all the camps from Poland and Czechoslovakia. And so Oskar Schindler at the time was able to get a permit from Amon Ged to move his factory to Brnice, Czechoslovakia, where he was born. And he lived not far away. And he wanted to bring all his people with him. Now he must have given Amanged a fortune of diamonds because Amanged agreed. So the women were taken out of the factory and were put on trains, and we thought we would go to Brünitz. I remember that they loaded us on those trains, and there was no room. There were 300 women, and I think probably 150 were in each of the boxcars. So there was no room to move around. You couldn't sit unless you sat on top of somebody else. There was no water, there was no food, there was no air, there were no bathroom facilities. And the train stood at the station for a long, long time. When the train finally started to move, it seemed like we just felt, because we had no windows to look, we tried to look through the little holes between the wood on a boxcar, and we just had a feeling that we were not going to Czechoslovakia. And the train finally stopped. After a long time, I remembered that the doors opened, and the first thing I saw was a spotlight shining on the train. And then I saw like miles and miles of barbed wires. And I saw like hundreds and hundreds. In my mind, that's what I saw, as guards, against all those innocent women, with the rifles, with the revolvers, with the whips, and with the dogs. And I remember seeing a sign that had Auschwitz-Birkenau. And then we knew. We had rumors about Auschwitz-Birkenau, but we didn't believe it. How could any normal human being believe that there are people who are actually made a business out of murdering innocent people? I remember as we were helped by other prisoners to go down jump down from the train. And we were so tired, we were so thirsty. And we thought it was snowing, but there was also a terrible stench in Auschwitz. And we wanted to catch the snowflakes. And we reached out our hands for the snowflakes, and we realized those were ashes. The families of the soldiers who guarded the camp, they used to complain to Berlin that they couldn't let their children play outside. They couldn't hang out their laundry because of the ashes. And I remember how we started to be beaten, and they were yelling at us, heraus, mach schnell, get out and hurry up. We were beaten like cows. We were herded, beaten by the soldiers with the whips. And we were running, and I realized that way ahead of me, I saw chimneys. It was night, it was very dark. I could still see the chimneys and the smoke coming from them. But I could not believe. Auschwitz was a huge place. There was Auschwitz I, which actually before the war had all the buildings there housed the Polish army. And that's where the Germans kept their religious prisoners, political prisoners, and others who didn't agree with them, and some POWs. But it was Auschwitz-Birkenau that they built, especially only for the destruction, for the murder of the Jews. All the Jews were victims, but there were some victims that were not Jews. And as we ran, we came to a halt in front of a huge barrack. And there was a group of very well-dressed and well-fed officers of the SS. And one of them, especially with a whip, was sending some women to the right and some women to the left. And we realized that these few women going to the left were older, could barely walk, needed help. But the ones that were going to the right could walk. So I remember how we all started to pinch our cheeks, and stand up straight. And we were pushed into this huge barrack. It was a big, huge barrack, and it was like there was nothing in it except benches all around, and then there was a group of prisoners ahead, and everybody had to undress, strip. We were told to fold our clothes and leave it on the benches because we were going to come back and get it back. I remember that I had a picture of my father under my tongue, and I saw that they were looking into everybody's mouths, because if anybody had a gold tooth, they would pull it up right there and there. So I took the picture of my father and put it in my shoe. And as we stood in line, we were shaved from head to bottom. And of course by the other prisoners who didn't really know how to do it. So they were pulling our hair and they were cutting our scalps, and we were crying, and they said, "You don't have to cry because you're not going to the gas, you're going to the showers." And by that time, of course, we didn't believe anyone anymore anything, because it was just too horrible to even think. And then they pushed us into the room, and if you saw the movie, it was just the way it is in the movie. It was dark. We didn't know what was in there. You couldn't see. And we were cold and we were shivering. And finally the light came on, and the water came down. It was cold water. And I look at my mom, and I look at all the people I was with, and I did not recognize anyone, because it were people I worked with all those years. And because when they shaved my hair, well, they shaved our hair, I think we were so totally dehumanized and so traumatized that I said to my mom, "We are dead. They killed us, but it didn't hurt." And my mom said, "No, we're going to be okay. We are alive." And I said, "No, look at us. Look at us." You know, when I was little, before the war, I had long braids. And then when we had to go into the ghetto, my mother took me to a hairdresser to get a haircut. And I remember when my father saw me, he cried. He said, "Where are our braids?" And in concentration camp in Prashov, we didn't have enough water. We never had any shampoo. But still, we had short hair. I had short hair, and so did all my friends. And you know what the girls do when they get up in the morning, no matter what? Even if there is a drop of water, you want to get it and try to fix your hair. And there we were, and some girls thought it was funny. I did not think it was funny. I thought it was the end of me. And after the showers, they pushed us to another room. We never went back to where we left our clothes. And in the other room, there were women guards. And women guards were so sadistic, they were much worse than men. And there was a pile of wooden shoes on one side and a pile of clothing on the other side. And we had to grab. Whatever you took, you had to put on. So, you know, if you put a wet foot into a wooden shoe, you get blisters right away. And you couldn't try the shoe. Whether it was small, you had to take it. Whether it was too big, you had to take it. And then at that time, they were not giving uniforms anymore. It was November 1944. And so just a pile of clothing. And I remember I saw something yellow with red. And just before the war started, I was going to go into the 5th grade. And that was the first time that my mom allowed me to buy my own, she went with me to the store when I was allowed to choose a fabric that I like, and she took me to a dressmaker. There were no department stores in those days. You couldn't, unless you sewed yourself, you had to go to a dressmaker. I had a cousin that was a dressmaker. And so I remember she made me the dress. To this day, I remember the dress. It was the first dress that I had chosen, and it was yellow with red puppies. So I grabbed that dress, and I was pulling and pulling and pulling, and I pulled out a chiffon dress. It was yellow. It had red flowers. It was chiffon. It was November. It was freezing, and I had to put it on my wet body, and tie it around me 10 times. It was a huge dress. It was a huge dress, must have belonged to a really big fat lady. And I was 12 years old, 13 years old, I think. And I was skinny, very, very skinny. And then they pushed us out to the other side. And there we stood for a moment and looked. And, you know, there are no words that can describe what Auschwitz looked like. Any wizard says, if you were not there, you will never know. You can't tell. All I saw was mud everywhere. Everything was grey. It was like during the war in the concentration camps, I don't think I ever saw flowers or grass or blooming tree or birds. Nothing but mud and destruction and despair everywhere you look. And of course the women guards were beating us and running with us to go to a barrack. The barrack we went in didn't have any bunk beds, didn't have any perches, which were like shelves, and we slept on the floor. And every morning and every night we had to stand in front of the barracks and for a roll call. And then we were counted. And our work was to, every morning some girls were sent to the kitchen and bring those big barrels with something that was supposed to be coffee, but it wasn't. I think everything was made of soda, including the little bread. The soups never had anything but potato peels. Once in a while I remember my aunt, one of my aunts, who was in Plaszow and was sent to Auschwitz. She came to Auschwitz really happy because the children that were smuggled from the ghetto to Plaszow were sent to Auschwitz. And my aunt thought that her little boy, she would find him. And when I met my aunt in Auschwitz, she came and she brought me a leaf of cabbage. It was my father's only sister. And of course, her baby was killed. And I didn't think she would ever be normal again. She was like, how can you explain to anybody who is normal in this time and this age what happens when little children are being taken away from their parents and you know that they were killed? In Auschwitz, why were we in Auschwitz? Because we were subhuman. The Germans considered Jewish people subhuman, worse than cockroaches. There was a 1% of Jews living in Germany. And everything that happened in Germany, they said it was the fault of the Jews. The fact that they lost the war, the fact that they didn't have enough employment, everything of that 1% of the Jews. I remember that what we did a lot this time we were in Auschwitz, that we carried mud in big barrels from one side to another and then back there. The two women in charge of the barrack were from Hungary. And they spoke Hungarian. We spoke mostly Polish, some of us spoke German. They didn't know, they didn't understand us, and we for sure didn't understand them. And they felt very powerful. And at one time when we stood a line up for a roll call, she went by and she slapped a friend of mine who stood in front of me, and she said to her, "Stop talking." And I said to her, "She never talked, she didn't say anything." And the woman said, "What do you mean she never talked? I heard her." I said, "No, stop, she didn't talk." So she said to me, she sent me back into the barrack, and she told me to kneel down and until I apologized. And the barrack was like a chimney blade through the whole end of the barrack. I said, "No, I didn't do anything." I wonder sometimes where I had the courage, the guts, or how stupid I was to do that. And I was kneeling there all day, and then at night, at the evening, we had to go again for a roll call. We had to be counted. And the other woman, the other Hungarian woman who was also in charge of the barrack, she told me to go out. Because if I didn't go out, there would be somebody missing, and then they would be responsible for it. We were lucky. The women on Schindler's List were in Auschwitz-Birkenau for 3.5 weeks. By that time, we had dysentery, we were sick, we were ready to go to the gas chambers. And Oskar Schindler came. Oskar Schindler made arrangement. He did not come. That's the one thing that didn't happen that is in the movie, that Oskar Schindler came to Auschwitz to take us. No, Oskar Schindler sent one of his secretaries with a fortune of diamonds to bribe the commander of Auschwitz, Rudolf Haas, to let us go. And they didn't want to let us go because they said to Oskar Schindler, they've been here for too long, they're not good anymore. I will send you new ones. And Oskar Schindler said, no, I want my workers because they are well trained. And this time we were able to sit in the boxcar. And one of my girlfriends was so very, very ill. And she was burning up with fever. And I remember trying to stick my little finger and try to scoop up a little bit of snow to put on her lips. She remembers to this day. She says, you gave me icicles. And about an hour after we left Auschwitz-Birkenau, she broke up in scarlet fever, which means that if we didn't leave, we would have all been sent to the gas chambers. Not because they cared about us, because they cared about themselves. The Germans were afraid that they would get it. I remember when the train finally stopped, and the doors opened, and there on the platform stood Oskar Schindler in all his glory, with the green Tyrolean hat with a feather in his hand, and with a cigarette always in his hand. And he said, well, you are finally here. And the men are here already, and because the men went separate. The men actually went to Gross Rosen and were kept there overnight in a horrible way, but they were sent to the factory to Brünitz after a couple of days, not like the women. And in Brünitz, Oskar Schindler and Mrs. Schindler came to help him. And they had a beautiful villa not too far from the camp, but they never slept in that villa. They had a small apartment on the factory floor, and that's where they slept. Because we were guarded by a lot of the Nazi soldiers, and the Obersturmführer Leopold, who was in charge, he actually had orders that if the war gets worse, to kill us. Well, Oskar Schindler and one of our friends, who after the war became the Chief Justice of Israel, Moshe Beisky, they created a document sending Obersturmführer Leopold to Berlin for an audience with Hitler. Naturally, he left. Naturally, he got to Berlin. Nobody wanted him there, so they sent him to the Russian front. But then Oskar Schindler was in charge of the guards. They also changed the guards. The younger guards were sent to the Russian front, and there were older men and some young boys who were in charge of us. And they were under the command of Oskar Schindler, who always gave them a lot of vodka and kept them busy so they didn't care, to kill us. Under Leopold, they were already digging graves. And then on Oskar Schindler's camp, the last 7 months of the war, hundreds of thousands of people died when they were on death march. In the worst winter of 1945, I think the worst winter of the 20th century, with the blizzards and below freezing weather, people walked, they had no clothes, they had no shoes, they were dying, they were being killed. Some were in the trains, left on a railroad station when the airplanes flew. And believe me, Roosevelt and Churchill, they knew very well what was happening. And when they flew over Auschwitz, the pilots could see and took pictures of the gas chambers and the chimneys. And they're flying over Auschwitz to Poznan to bomb the factories. And so they were back to a Polish carrier came to Roosevelt and begged him to bomb the railroad to Auschwitz. Roosevelt never said a word. He just listened, never said a word. But I saw a telegram in the French in Paris in a museum that said to the French that we cannot bomb anything that doesn't have a direct effect on a war. So they were not going to do anything to save any people who were in Auschwitz or other camps. And they knew exactly what the camps were because they could see it. So when the war was ending, Oskar Schindler had to flee. We were going to be liberated by the Russians, and they would kill him. He was a member of the Nazi Party. He was a manufacturer of ammunition. He was the owner of slaves. And the fact that the slaves survived because of him wouldn't mean a thing to the Russians. And when he left, we all cried. We didn't know what was going to happen with us. When the Russians came and liberated us, they told us, don't go back to Poland, they don't want you there. But we had no place to go. We all wanted to go back, and the Russians arranged for us to go back. And only to find that we had lost all our family. My father and his 6 brothers, my aunts, my uncles, my little cousins, my grandparents. On Schindler's List, my mother and I survived with one of my uncles and my grandfather, my father's father. My grandfather was the oldest person, I think, I'm pretty sure, who survived the war. He was 75 years old. It would never have happened if it was not on Schindler's List. When we came back to Poland and we came to see if anybody was in our building, we were the only 2 that came back. Around the corner from where my grandparents used to live, apartments were empty or occupied by other people. Nobody came back. So you see, Oskar Schindler is like the shining star, like an example of what a person can do. That each and every one of us has the power to make a decision. And certainly we have to teach our children that they are all smart enough and strong enough to make a difference. And they know what's wrong from right. And especially during the bully times, there's so many bullies. I tell my kids that the bully is a coward. He never attacks somebody who is bigger or stronger. And when you see something happen, whether somebody's taunting with words or beating up on your friend or anybody, go get help. You can do that, it's easy. You know, it's always easier to be kind. Because people who hate, and there are people and little children who are now taught how to hate. People who hate don't know anything else. They don't know how to read or write. They only know how to hate. And hate makes you blind and deaf. And this is the only, I think, hope for the world. For people not to hate, but for people to help each other. And I think you feel better yourself when you do something to help somebody else. And I know, I have great hope for our future children. And that's why I feel it's so important for us, for the survivors whose numbers are diminishing every day, and for the veterans whose numbers are also diminishing every day, to pass the torch of memory to the second generation and those yet to come, so that they will never forget, because I think forgetting is dangerous. We cannot forget the genocide and the Holocaust. And the Armenian Holocaust, when Hitler was talking about the final solution of the Jews, And somebody said to him, how will the world react? How can we do it? And he said, who now remembers the Armenian? And he was right. Nobody remembers the Armenians. I never knew about the genocide of Armenians till I got connected with Facing History in Ourselves, who wrote a book about the Armenians. And the Armenian people actually started to talk about their tragedy, about what happened to them, after they heard the Holocaust survivors talking about it. They said they also felt that people wouldn't care and wouldn't want to listen. So there is a lot of things that we can do to help our children understand. Because they do. People know when they do something wrong. And our children are so smart. They can really make changes. And also I tell them if they are not happy with anything, they should write a letter or email. In my days, you used to send a telegram to the White House, you would get an answer. And the kids now, if they email to the president or vice president or the senator or congressman, whoever, they will also get email back. Because the kids think that the president, will send an email, but they don't know that the president has a lot of people to take care of his mail. And so I think that we all have to, hope that things will get better in the future. Because certainly things are not good now. And another thing about Steven Spielberg is that with every penny he made from the movie, he created what we call the Shoah Foundation. He has interviewed the survivors of the Holocaust, and he's now interviewing the survivors of genocide. He's interviewing people in Rwanda and Somalia and Darfur and all over. He had over 55,000 testimonies translated into 31 languages. He gave it all to the University of California in Los Angeles. And now anybody, after flicking eyewitness, you can hear anybody's testimony that you want in any language. And I had one of my recent experiences was that while I was talking to a group of people, one person came over and asked me to sign a book. And this was Schindler's book in French. And I never really thought about it. I mean, I knew that the book was translated into many, many languages, but to actually see it, and somebody younger, somebody who certainly had no connection to the war and the Holocaust, somebody younger was reading it, made me very happy. So I hope if you have any questions, I'll be very happy to answer.